Sarah's apartment was far from luxurious, but it was hers. A small, two-bedroom unit tucked in a quiet, forgotten part of the city. It was perfect for a young woman starting out on her own, eager to build a life away from the sleepy town she had left behind. She had found the apartment after days of searching online, drawn to its high ceilings, large windows, and a layout that felt spacious enough for her humble beginnings. Most importantly, it was affordable, a true gem in a city where everything else seemed out of her price range. Upon entering the apartment for the first time, her eyes landed on the bathroom mirror. It was large, an antique piece framed in dark, ornate wood. The edges were worn, but the glass was clear, reflecting the faint light from the room. Something about the mirror caught Sarah's attention right away. Its age, perhaps, or the way it seemed to loom over her. But the landlord assured her that it was just a relic of the building's history and added character. She shrugged it off, deciding that the mirror added an element of charm to an otherwise plain bathroom. Life began to fall into a routine. Sarah worked a 9-to-5 job at a local bookstore, a job she adored, but it didn't take long before she noticed something peculiar. At first, it was subtle, almost dismissible. One evening, as she was brushing her hair in front of the mirror, she noticed that her reflection seemed a fraction of a second slower than her movements. At first, she chalked it up to fatigue or perhaps the low lighting, but it nagged at her. Soon, it wasn't just a delay in movement. It was as though her reflection was doing something completely different than she was. Sarah would be combing through her hair, and her reflection would be still, staring back at her with an unsettling intensity. The first time it happened, she froze, unsure whether she had imagined it. The reflection was simply too still. Despite her unease, she dismissed it. After all, she had just moved into the apartment. Maybe it was just her mind adjusting to the new environment, she thought. Days passed, and Sarah's suspicion turned to anxiety. She started seeing more and more signs that something wasn't quite right with the mirror. The way her reflection lingered a moment too long before mimicking her movements. First it was a delay, then an unnatural stillness. But one evening it went beyond mere discomfort. Sarah had just finished a long day at work and entered her apartment, tired but relieved to be home. She headed straight to the bathroom, needing to freshen up. As she stood before the mirror, applying a thin layer of makeup, she felt a strange sensation, a coldness that swept over her. The air around her seemed to thicken. Her reflection didn't move. It stayed unnaturally still, its gaze locked on her with an intensity she had never seen before. For a moment, Sarah forgot to breathe, feeling as if the reflection was staring into her soul. It wasn't her expression either. The reflection smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that didn't match the cautious expression Sarah wore. Frozen, Sarah backed away, heart pounding in her chest. She hurried out of the bathroom, only to find that she couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. It was as if the reflection had followed her into the rest of the apartment. She didn't sleep that night, constantly checking the bathroom mirror, half expecting to see that grin again. But there was nothing, just the normal reflection of a tired woman who had no idea what was happening to her. The next few days were a blur of anxiety. Each time she looked into the mirror, it felt like the reflection was doing something just a little off, turning its head at the wrong time, smiling when she wasn't. One evening, Sarah was brushing her teeth and glanced up at the mirror. She froze. Her reflection was staring straight ahead, its expression still, while she continued to brush her teeth, oblivious. But then, something shifted. The reflection began to smile, a smile too wide for any person to achieve. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away from the mirror, terror flooding her veins. But no matter how far she moved, her reflection remained, frozen, smiling that grotesque smile, staring at her as if it knew something she didn't. The terror escalated. Sarah's sleep was plagued by nightmares of being trapped in the mirror, her own reflection grinning at her, reaching out from the glass and pulling her in. She couldn't escape the feeling that it was only a matter of time before the reflection would take over completely. Desperate for answers, she scoured the internet, searching for anything that could explain the strange happenings in her apartment. To her shock, she stumbled upon an old local legend, a story about the building she now lived in. The building had once been the home of a woman named Evelyn, who had mysteriously disappeared many years ago. The only thing that remained was her mirror, said to hold strange powers. According to the story, every tenant who had lived there had experienced odd occurrences, mirrors that acted as if they had a life of their own, reflections that didn't match reality, and sometimes people disappearing entirely. A cold dread washed over Sarah as she read through the accounts of others who had lived in the building. The mirror was no mere object. It was a doorway, a portal to something dark and malevolent. The last account was from a woman who had disappeared without a trace, leaving only a reflection in the mirror, a reflection that still lingered to this day. That night, Sarah decided she had to confront the mirror. She couldn't keep running. As she stood before it, she steeled herself. She stared directly into her reflection, her heart racing. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice trembling. But the reflection didn't respond. It simply stared back with that same sinister grin. Suddenly, the air grew cold. The glass began to ripple, as if alive. Sarah stepped back, her breath coming in short gasps. The reflection began to move without her. It tilted its head in a mocking gesture. It reached up, placing its hand on the glass, pressing against it as if it could reach out. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She was frozen in place, unable to tear her eyes away. The reflection began to speak, but not in words. It was a guttural whisper, a distorted version of her own voice. "You shouldn't have looked at me," it hissed. The glass began to tremble, distorting Sarah's image, warping it until it became unrecognizable. The reflection reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, and suddenly it was no longer a reflection at all. It was real, reaching out for her. Sarah screamed as the mirror pulsed with energy. The air thickened, and the reflection pulled her in, her body unable to resist. The last thing she felt was cold glass pressing against her skin. And then, nothing. The apartment was eerily silent the next day. The mirror stood, as it always had, a silent witness to the horrors it had unleashed. But if you looked closely, you might see a faint, distorted reflection trapped in the glass. Someone staring back, grinning with that same cold, knowing smile. The stranger in every mirror grows from an ordinary experience into an unbearable horror, with Sarah's growing realization that her reflection is no longer just a reflection. It's something far more sinister, something that wants to escape and take her place. The haunting mirror symbolizes the idea of losing oneself and confronting the darkness within, in a way that is both terrifying and relatable to anyone who has ever questioned what lies beneath the surface.